Good morning. We are not, while this is extremely spiritual and beautiful, we are not at church. Buenos dias. What a blessing it is to be up here opening the first panel for HR25. Yes, let's wake up, please. My native language, Dhaka, Sam Rivera. I am Sam Rivera, Executive Director of On Point NYC. More importantly, I'm the son of Rosa Rodriguez, el hijo de Rosa Rodriguez, most amazing woman ever to walk this planet. My mom, who taught me everything, anything that's good about me is because of my mom, for sure. I want to announce that we are live on television on RCTVC, Senal, Colombia. One thing you will learn from me is that I speak Spanish, but my Spanish isn't very good looking. So bear with me as I mispronounce and make all those often mistakes. You know what? It's a great time to be in harm reduction. It's an amazing time to be in this work. One of the things I learned when I got here, and especially yesterday, was as much as I sometimes criticize how we go to events and spend time together, a lot of us really needed to be here together. We really did. The amount of love I've received since landing here, I didn't realize I needed. The hugs, watching people see each other for the first time in a while, those moments when you jump up and hug someone, feels so amazing. The other piece is watching so many young people who are coming up next. Some of us have been in this work a long time. I'm celebrating my 30-something. Celebrating my 33rd year in this work. And then I realized I have the wrong shirt on. So I have the right shirt for the wrong thing. And when I got into this work, I was blessed to be a young member I'm looking at you, Charles. I was blessed to be a young member of ACT UP New York. And one of the things we did really well is we only focused on what we had in common. That was the most important thing. That we were so different. We were eclectic. We were a motley crew of people who loved people who used drugs, of people who loved people who were living with HIV. And it was such a blessing for me to come through that and learn that way and learn how to move in that energy, which is what I'm bringing today. And in my indigenous way, we move in a specific energy. So I'm offering Seneko Kakona, abundant blessings to everybody in this gathering. I ask you to view this as a gathering. It's a gathering of people moving in the same energy. It's a gathering of people who care about people who use drugs. And it's a gathering of people who are not going to allow, no matter what administration we have, to step up and do the right things and believe that we've been through worse. People are giving us condolences for the United States. And I don't accept them. And I don't accept them because we have amazing people in the United States doing amazing work. So I end this with this here. 3 amazing women are doing work nationally, and they're leading the way. Cassandra Frederick, Tracy Gardner, and Laura Guzman. And as a man who grew up with a very powerful mother and amazing aunts and 2 sisters, be careful when women are leading. Stuff's gonna happen and stuff's gonna get done. So welcome. You are not ready, but I hope you get ready for this amazing panel. I'm going to introduce them one at a time, ask them to share a little bit about themselves. And I'm telling you now, just brace yourself, it's going to be amazing. So first to speak is Ali Bantú Ashanti, co-founder and director of Colectivo, Justicia Racial. Thank you.
Quiero extender un saludo a todos y todas por igual. En muchos espacios y muchos de nosotros hemos repetido que la guerra contra las drogas fracasó. Déjenme decirles con toda claridad, la guerra contra las drogas no fracasó. La guerra contra las drogas ha sido un éxito rotundo, un éxito mortal. Mi nombre es Ali Bantú Ashanti. Soy un hombre de Timbiquí, nacido en el Pacífico colombiano, criado en territorios de luchas, violencias, pero sobre todo de resistencias. He visto de frente la pobreza, el hambre, la muerte, pero también la capacidad infinita de mi comunidad para seguir pariendo la vida. Hoy hablo en nombre del colectivo Justicia Racial, una comunidad de abogados, abogadas y humanistas que trabajan sin descanso por un cambio radical en la política de drogas, pero también en las fuerzas de seguridad, por el respeto de los derechos humanos y sobre todo por la construcción de una nueva justicia en Colombia. La guerra contra las drogas fue diseñada desde el principio para someter, para neutralizar a las izquierdas, para aplastar los movimientos negros, indígenas y populares, para mantener bajo vigilancia permanente a los cuerpos considerados peligrosos para el orden colonial. Fue la herramienta perfecta del racismo moderno. Más pulida, más técnica, más mortal. Si la guerra contra las drogas fuera una operación de rescate social, sus resultados se medirían en vidas salvadas, en derechos restituidos, en oportunidades abiertas. Pero sus verdaderos efectos hablan otro idioma: el encarcelamiento masivo, el desplazamiento forzado, la violencia policial y la perpetuación de la desigualdad. Entre 2018 y 2023, el número de personas encarceladas por delitos de drogas a nivel mundial aumentó de 10.74 a 11.5 millones, casi 2 millones de personas más. Mientras tanto, más de 100.000 millones de dólares son destinados cada año a esta guerra contra la vida, contra las personas, en un mundo donde se estima que en 2030 el 44% de la población mundial vivirá con menos de 6.85 dólares por día. Esta lógica punitivista golpea aún más a las mujeres. El 35% de ellas están privadas de la libertad por delitos relacionados con drogas, frente a un 19% de los hombres. Y no son las grandes narcotraficantes, son madres cabeza de familia, jóvenes desempleadas, atrapadas en redes donde su vida vale menos que 1 kilo de cocaína o de marihuana. El mercado, mientras tanto, no se detiene. En 2023, Colombia incautó 743 toneladas de droga pero se estima que produce más de 2.600 al año, demostrando que el negocio no se debilita, se adapta y se expande. Hoy Colombia es un testigo sangrante de este éxito de la guerra contra las drogas. Cárceles reventadas, barrios sitiados, futuros hipotecados. Las cárceles colombianas son hoy el mejor trofeo de quienes creen que esta guerra tiene sentido. Para ellos, cada celda llena es una medalla, cada recluso una prueba de que están haciendo bien el trabajo. Pero si miramos de cerca esos trofeos, no veremos precisamente a los banqueros del narcotráfico, ni a los políticos o empresarios que negocian con mafias y trafican con la vida de millones de personas. Veremos jóvenes racializados de barrios pobres, mujeres cabeza de familia utilizadas como meras mercancías, campesinos olvidados que cultivaron coca porque no había otra opción. Los verdaderos artífices del negocio negocian con la libertad y en libertad, organizando nuevas rutas, cerrando grandes negocios, mercantilizando vidas humanas, a quienes consideran como seres fungibles, y para suerte de los grandes capitales, estos millones de descartables no tienen otra opción. A marzo de 2025, Colombia cuenta con 168.000 personas privadas de la libertad. La población carcelaria ha aumentado significativamente y los casos de reincidencia alcanzan los 26.000. El hacinamiento es del 27,4% según datos del INPEC y Colombia ocupa el puesto 19 a nivel mundial en población carcelaria. Cada nueva condena es un avance de la justicia, es una nueva capa de olvido, pobreza y dolor para los mismos de siempre. El sistema carcelario no resocializa, no reintegra, profundiza la exclusión, fabrica dolor, siembra desesperanza. Los falsos positivos, las condenas desproporcionadas, los encarcelamientos masivos de pobres son piezas de esta arquitectura de muerte. La guerra contra las drogas es y ha sido siempre un proyecto colonial. Un proyecto que clasifica, que racializa, que define quién merece vivir y quién puede ser descartado sin escándalo en la democracia colombiana. Como bien señalaron Aníbal Quijano, María Lugones y Franz Fanon, el colonialismo no es pasado, es una matriz viva de poder que administra la vida y la muerte. Los muertos de Tumaco, Timbiquí, Buenaventura, Oquibdó o Soacha no son accidentes ni tragedias naturales. Son productos planificados de un sistema global que necesita mantener la desigualdad para someter y sostener sus privilegios. En este mundo nosotros nosotros todos aquí presentes somos los descartables, los fungibles, los desechables, aquellos a quienes se puede encarcelar, matar o desaparecer sin alterar un ápice de la normalidad del sistema. El sistema internacional ha aprendido a ignorar nuestros duelos, a convertir nuestra muerte en paisaje de fondo, en cifras frías que celebran el éxito de su política de muerte. Y nosotros, desde nuestras orillas de resistencia, decimos: no más. Hoy les convoco, no a un debate cómodo ni a una charla académica que olvide la sangre, sino a un despertar profundo de la conciencia. Cada línea de cocaína inhalada en Berlín, París o Nueva York lleva consigo la vida rota de familias enteras en Tumaco, Timbiquí o Buenaventura. Cada fiesta despreocupada en el norte global está manchada de desplazamientos forzados, de desapariciones, de condenas desproporcionadas, de violencia y supervigilancia policial en nuestro sur olvidado. No me malinterpreten. Apoyamos profundamente las políticas de reducción de daños. Mientras la guerra contra las drogas sigue manchando nuestros ríos y mares con sangre, otros hemos aprendido que existe otro camino: el amor por la vida y la necesaria justicia que adolecen nuestras débiles democracias. La lógica de la reducción de daños es revolucionaria. Dejar de tratar a los usuarios como criminales y empezar a tratarlos como seres humanos. Colombia ha dado pequeños pasos en ese sentido. Algunos programas comunitarios, algunos cambios en el discurso. Pero falta pasar de la retórica a una transformación real que integre salud, educación, empleo y vivienda como ejes centrales. Nadie se rehabilita si al salir de un centro de tratamiento no tiene hogar donde dormir ni trabajo digno que lo sustente. Salvar vidas de usuarios, acompañarlos y reconocer su dignidad es parte central de nuestra lucha. Pero no podemos quedarnos allí. Debemos ir al origen. Debemos preguntarnos de dónde vienen esas sustancias, a qué costo humano, sobre qué vidas se construye el derecho al consumo. No habrá verdadera política de drogas humanitaria si no se aborda también el circuito de muerte que sostiene el mercado. Y en este marco es que hoy proponemos abrir sin miedo una discusión urgente. La necesidad de despenalizar no solo el consumo, sino también el tráfico de drogas por personas en situación de vulnerabilidad económica. Queremos hablar, por ejemplo, de los lancheros del Pacífico y el Caribe colombiano. Hombres negros y empobrecidos, en su mayoría empujados por la miseria, el abandono y la falta de oportunidades, se ven obligados a apostar su propia vida transportando cargamentos de drogas para poder sobrevivir. No son narcos del cuello blanco, No son empresarios del crimen, son padres, hermanos, hijos, vecinos que enfrentan penas de 10, 15 o 20 años de prisión por un viaje en una lancha. ¿Puede llamarse justicia a un sistema que castiga con saña al más pobre, al más vulnerable, mientras protege a los grandes beneficiarios del negocio? ¿Puede hablar de legalidad un Estado que empuja a la población a la ilegalidad para luego criminalizarla y castigarla? Despenalizar el tráfico de drogas no es justificar la criminalidad, es reconocer que no puede haber penas iguales para realidades absolutamente desiguales. Es humanizar un debate hoy secuestrado por el punitivismo y la hipocresía. Si no nos movilizamos contra el racismo, la guerra contra las drogas y las injusticias, como señaló James Bowen, la consecuencia de la falta de cambio en políticas de drogas será el fuego, el caos que podría resultar de la falta de justicia, para que nunca más nuestra sangre sea combustible del negocio de otros, para que nunca más nuestras cárceles sean sus vitrinas de éxito, para que nunca más. Muchas gracias.
Told you. I mean, you're just gonna love this passion, right? We were unintentionally told to wake you up, so it's happening. I want to quickly introduce our next speaker, Silvie Ojeda, international communication strategist and human rights activist.
En primer lugar, quiero pedir permiso a las entidades ancestrales que me han precedido en este territorio para dirigirme a todos ustedes. Buenos días a todos, todas y todes. Mi nombre es Silvie Ojeda y hago parte del maravilloso equipo de Metzineres, desde donde venimos avanzando una reflexión para construir un mundo antiprohibicionista, antirracista, anticapitalista, antipatriarcal. Pero para llegar a este lugar debemos empezar por el principio, una descolonización real y material de nuestras sociedades. Y por eso vengo hoy con una intervención que parte de una pregunta urgente. ¿Cómo se entrelazan las políticas de drogas, el racismo estructural y la colonización del saber en nuestros territorios? Continuando con la maravillosa ponencia de mi compañero Ali, dijo épicamente Frantz Fanon que no basta con descolonizar el territorio, también hay que descolonizar el deseo. Y eso es muy importante. Y yo quiero poner el foco en descolonizar el deseo porque cuando hablamos de ello, tenemos que hablar de la colonización de las subjetividades, que es un proceso que ha venido ocurriendo desde hace 500 años, como lo eso que se haya sinoptativo. En Latinoamérica decimos cuando a una persona le gusta mucho lo que pasa en el exterior y no reconoce el valor de su territorio, le decimos que tiene el mal de Malinche. La Malinche fue una de las mujeres indígenas que fue entregada a Cortés como esclava y con quien ella tuvo un hijo y terminó en una relación de pareja por la cual fue históricamente rechazada, porque se dijo que ella se había enamorado del colonizador. Infelizmente, cuando hablamos de la colonización de las subjetividades, esto es lo que nos está pasando, que se nos ha impuesto una identidad que no se refleja a sí misma, sino en el colonizador. La colonización de la subjetividad moldea nuestra identidad y moldea nuestros territorios, que no son solo espacios geográficos, sino espacios, los territorios colonizados, que han sido marcados por el estigma, por la vergüenza, por la explotación y el saqueo simbólico y material. Esa colonización de subjetividades ha sido instrumental y lo sigue siendo hoy cuando crea el concepto de territorio marginal como un espacio de peligro, un espacio de criminalidad, un espacio de carencia, de pobreza, de vulgaridad. Una narrativa que vemos que se reproduce todos los días en los medios, en los discursos dominantes y en las políticas públicas. A través de esas representaciones de territorios marginales se consolida una narrativa de inferioridad intrínseca que marca a cada uno de los cuerpos que habitan estos territorios como sujetos de segunda clase. Ese marcaje tiene impactos no solo simbólicos, sino materiales y físicos en la vida de las personas. Si vemos los informes Favelas Namira Duchiero y Efeito Bumerangue del Centro de Estudios de Seguridad y Ciudadanía en Brasil, nos ofrecen evidencia clara de cómo esa narrativa sustenta las políticas de seguridad ciudadana que operan en las favelas. Las favelas, entonces, esos territorios marginales, son tratados como zonas de guerra, territorios habitados por ciudadanos de segunda clase, que crea ese colonialismo de las subjetividades. De esta manera, como bien lo decía mi compañero, las políticas no apuntan ni al tráfico internacional ni al lavado de dinero, sino al cuerpo pobre, negro, joven, a la madre cabeza de familia. Como lo decía claramente uno de estos informes, el Estado no está ausente, está presente y armado, y lo está contra los mismos de siempre. Pero además de sustentar esta necropolítica que se ejecuta desde los territorios, en los barrios, en las favelas, en las periferias, en las zonas rurales alejadas, en los espacios de frontera, la colonización de las subjetividades produce esa forma de identidad impuesta que está atravesada por la pobreza, la violencia, el racismo, pero sobre todo el desprecio. Es esa colonización, es esa creación de esa identidad inferior, es esa delimitación de territorios marginales la que sustenta ese dispositivo que llamamos guerra, donde para asegurar la seguridad y el bienestar de algunos ciudadanos se acepta que mueran los otros, los de segunda categoría, que son etiquetados día a día como bandidos, criminales, carentes de valor. Y por eso se permiten atrocidades que serían impensables en territorios no colonizados. Hasta aquí está claro que el proceso de colonización de las subjetividades creó territorios marginales, moldeó la identidad de inferioridad asociada a estos territorios considerados marginales, creó una narrativa que sustenta la muerte y la exclusión de los cuerpos que habitamos estos territorios. Pero desafortunadamente los impactos de esta matriz de colonización no acaban ahí. Como ya lo expresó Buenaventura de Sosa, la colonización también colonizó el saber y día tras día ejecuta el famoso epistemicidio, el asesinato de los saberes, donde aquella categorización de identidades hace que algunos ciudadanos en los territorios que han sido colonizadores creen estándares de conocimiento donde solo es válido el conocimiento occidental y sus formas, mientras día a día se deslegitiman nuestros saberes ancestrales, locales, basados sobre todo en la evidencia. Ayer escuchamos en este panel hablar de la importancia de la evidencia y yo creo que es importante la evidencia, pero no solo la evidencia científica, sino la evidencia de la experiencia vivida, la evidencia de aquellas que construimos desde los territorios. Es una experiencia de la cual somos expertos, un saber del cual somos expertos y es un saber con el que venimos construyendo presentes posibles como acto de supervivencia y de resistencia. Sin embargo, estos saberes no son escuchados ni validados, porque como ya lo decía la filósofa india Gayatri Spivak en su teoría de la subalternidad, ella explica que incluso cuando el colonizado intenta hablar, su voz es sistemáticamente silenciada, o peor, es traducida erróneamente por estructuras de poder. El subalterno, esta identidad inferior, no es que no pueda hablar, gritamos, no es que no tengamos voz, sino que el sistema no quiere escucharnos en nuestros propios términos. Así, día a día, cuando se hace el epistemicidio de los saberes de los territorios de barrio, de favela, de periferia, de zona rural, cuando se cree que somos un aglomerado de personas inferiores, se invisibiliza la complejidad social, económica y la complejidad cultural. Este epistemicidio es una forma de violencia simbólica que acompaña a la violencia material y física que asesina nuestros cuerpos. Y lo peor es que impone ese marco jurídico, técnico, criminalizador, desde el cual se está decidiendo hoy en día quién tiene derecho a caminar por la calle sin ser detenido por la policía, quién tiene derecho a consumir o no sustancias, quién tiene derecho a hablar y sobre todo quién tiene derecho a existir. Las comunidades que hemos sido colonizadas o que seguimos siendo colonizadas, al no producir aquel saber válido según la lógica dominante, somos tratados como sujetos de intervención, no como sujetos de derecho. Y es precisamente esa condición de ser sujetos de intervención lo que sustenta el dispositivo llamado guerra, que genera el control territorial y simbólico de nuestros territorios y nuestros cuerpos. Y entonces aquí yo creo que para ustedes se empieza a quedar claro y se empieza a responder la pregunta de cuál es la conexión entre políticas de drogas, racismo estructural y asesinato de saberes. Las políticas de drogas en Brasil, Colombia, México y muchos otros territorios colonizados operan bajo una lógica de guerra en la cual algunos territorios son convertidos en campos de operaciones militares. Esta militarización selectiva se justifica por la construcción histórica y discursiva de que la favela, el barrio, la zona rural es un espacio donde vive un enemigo interno, un enemigo de cada uno de nosotros. Y entonces se justifica el accionar armado de las fuerzas del Estado, de las fuerzas policiales, mientras se ausenta el Estado sistemáticamente en políticas de salud, de educación y sobre todo en la protección de nuestros derechos fundamentales. Entonces, cuando decimos que la colonización continúa, nos referimos a esto, porque realmente para hacer un proceso de descolonización tendríamos que empezar por deconstruir esa identidad y esa categorización. Deconstruirla a través de un proceso profundo de análisis, pero sobre todo entendiendo que esa construcción discursiva, esa epistemología abismal donde solo se acepta el saber civilizado, colonizó hace muchos años lo que Carl Jung llamó el inconsciente colectivo. Ese imaginario donde nos encontramos todos, pero que es inconsciente, también tiene la creación de estas identidades inferiorizadas. Y es ese inconsciente colectivo el lugar donde hoy vive el prejuicio inconsciente, el unconscious bias, que sustenta el racismo, la exclusión y el estigma. Pero entonces, ¿cuál es el llamado?, se preguntarán ustedes. ¿Cómo hacemos para realmente descolonizar y con esa descolonización detener el epistemicidio, detener la subalternidad y por sobre todo detener la muerte injusta de nuestros pueblos mientras hay quienes continúan enriqueciéndose y controlando nuestros territorios? La respuesta a mí me la dio la patrona Cida Bento en su maravillosa obra El Pacto de la Blanquitud, que les invito a leer. Porque vivimos en una sociedad donde el silencio es una estrategia de dominación, pero no el silencio de los oprimidos, que siempre ha estado lleno de gritos, sino el silencio de quien domina, de quien ha construido un pacto para mantenerse en el poder, un pacto que no ha sido nombrado. A lo largo de la historia, ese silencio ha funcionado como un blindaje de la estructura colonial, una alianza implícita entre quienes heredaron el poder de la conquista, la expropiación y el saqueo. Ese pacto no necesita firmarse todos los días ni discutirse. Ese pacto vive en las instituciones, en los planes de estudio que se enseñan en los colegios, en los criterios de mérito, en quién se contrata y quién no se contrata, quién tiene buena ortografía, quién no, quién se presenta bien vestido a una entrevista de trabajo. Vive en los salones donde se toman decisiones, pero vive sobre todo en el inconsciente colectivo que considera legítimo, bello, solamente aquello que es civilizado, aquello que responde a ese criterio colonizado. Quien nace con el privilegio de heredar la identidad del ciudadano de primera clase, un día, estudiando historia, se da cuenta que la esclavitud y la colonización no fueron lindos y entonces decide por decreto que no hace parte de la colonización, que no es racista. Pero por decreto no ocurren los cambios. No se mira, no analiza cuánto del privilegio y del prejuicio inconsciente, cuánto de ese inconsciente colectivo, cuánto de eso de haber nacido y heredado el privilegio tiene dentro de sí. No se detiene a pensar por qué hay más personas pobres y racializadas en las cárceles que en las universidades. No se para a pensar por qué hoy en este auditorio transexuales sistemáticamente marginadas. Y no se da cuenta que su falta de reconocimiento del propio privilegio es la desigualdad que vivimos. No se da cuenta cuando se saca las drogas. En los territorios colonizadores se está hablando de drogas, pero en los territorios colonizados estamos hablando de guerra material y física, no simbólica, aunque también. A esa falta de reconocimiento de propio privilegio, a ese silencio que moldea y mantiene el orden racial, Cida Bento le dio un nombre, le llamó el Pacto de la Blanquitud. Yo lo quiero llamar hoy el Pacto de los Colonizadores. Ese pacto que se materializa en los planes de estudio que exaltan el pensamiento europeo e invisibilizan los conocimientos afrodiaspóricos e indígenas. Actúa en las universidades públicas donde durante más de 100 años casi no había personas negras en las aulas. Según datos oficiales del 2022, mientras que los negros y pardos son el 56% de la población brasileña, no representan el 18% del cuerpo docente en las universidades y menos del 5% ocupa cargos directivos. Romper el pacto exige valentía, no de quienes viven en los márgenes impuestos, sino de quienes ocupan el centro legítimo. Romper el pacto es reconocer el privilegio y renunciar decididamente a los espacios de decisión para construir nuevas formas de compartir el conocimiento. Porque no se trata de benevolencia, no se trata de filantropía ni de altruismo, se trata de justicia histórica. Porque al final, lo que está en disputa no es el derecho a consumir drogas, sino el derecho a existir plenamente, a narrarse con las propias palabras, a construir un mundo donde las voces históricamente silenciadas suenen como centrales. Un mundo donde el saber no tenga dueños, donde el poder no tenga color y donde resistir no sea una carga solitaria, sino un gesto colectivo de resistencia. Y esta descolonización únicamente se puede dar si cada uno de nosotros revisamos nuestro privilegio. Nuestro privilegio blanco, nuestro privilegio de pertenecer a un territorio colonizador, de haber heredado los beneficios de la colonización y contrastarnos con la realidad de los cuerpos de territorios colonizados, evidenciando las abismales diferencias de oportunidades de ser escuchado. Y entonces ahí, decididamente, optemos por romper el pacto tácito y silencioso, aceptando que sí, que formamos parte de él. Nadie nos lo preguntó, pero nos fue heredado. Y nuestro estado de bienestar hoy en día es resultado de un proceso colonizador de despojo y muerte que aún no cesa. El proceso de colonización y opresión es el ejercicio que yo voy a hacer de empujar este vaso hacia el borde de la mesa. Ustedes o todos nosotros tenemos dos opciones. Si este es el ejercicio de colonización, el agua cae y es un ejercicio de opresión. Tenemos la opción de ayudar este proceso de colonización. Tenemos la opción de detener el proceso de colonización o tenemos la opción de no hacer nada. La diferencia es que de tres opciones hay solo dos resultados. El vaso se cae o no se cae. Así que no hacer nada no es una opción, porque el vaso se va a seguir cayendo. Entonces, en el final de esta charla, no es una conclusión, sino una convocatoria. ¿Ustedes qué dicen? ¿Rompemos el pacto? Hoy quiero dedicar estas palabras a Jaime Garzón, que fue una persona muy importante en mi vida, que me la arrebató la guerra, y a Marielle Franco, líder femenina, feminista, brasilera, que fue asesinado también en las manos de esta guerra. Muchas gracias.
Wow, okay. No lo hablo bien, pero entiendo. You like that? That was pretty decent, huh, Rafi? I got a pass for that. Wow, just amazing. I think it's clear that she's an amazing human rights advocate, as many of you in this room are, right? So I present our next presenter, our next speaker, Kojo Koram, academic and writer currently teaching law at Birkbeck College, University of London.
Wow. I mean, that was amazing from Ali and Silvie, so I don't know what I can say to really follow that, but first of all, let me just introduce myself. So my name's Kojo Koram, and I'm an academic from London via Ghana, where I was born, and it's a real honor to be here at the Harm Reduction Conference speaking to you all. This is actually my first Harm Reduction Conference, despite having been in drug policy now for a while, and it feels like Harm Reduction Hall of Fame walking around here. Like, I feel like everywhere I'm like, oh, that's that person, or oh, I read that work, and yeah, it's you know, it's people in here who gave me my first job working in drug policy, or who I was reading when I was a student or a teenager, just trying to make sense of this crazy war on drugs. You know, when I actually arrived in Bogota, I went to a kind of combatants bar, and they had all these pictures of these, you know, generals from the armed struggle, and I thought, oh, that's a little bit like harm reduction. Like, you're walking around and there's all these like 4-star generals from the war on drugs who've been, you know, fighting for all these changes for so long, and you know, it made me think like, well, what can I say? What could I offer to such a room? And so I was, in preparing for the speech, comforted by the words of the First World War French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. That's the first time Georges Clemenceau has been mentioned at a harm reduction conference. But he had a quote, at least that's attributed to him, that I think is quite useful for thinking about where we are with drug policy in 2025, where he said, the things you've always got to make sure with the generals is that they sometimes prepare for the last war, and we've got to prepare for the next war. I think before what I used for instance, some of the trees, you know, the state also. I started off working in drug policy around 2011, 2012, and you know, I was a kind of newly qualified lawyer. I'm from an African immigrant background, so you know, all my family were like, go and become a corporate lawyer and make money. You know, what are you doing with this drug policy stuff? This is going nowhere. This is never going to change. You know, it was around, you know, Occupy time. So I said to my mom, capitalism's finished. It's going to be over in a couple of years. I'm going to work in drug policy reform. You know, she still hasn't really forgiven me for that, but regardless. But over the decade, there has been amazing change in drug policy reform. You know, it hasn't been a dead end. We've seen harm reduction services spread across jurisdictions from Africa to Asia. We've seen decriminalization on the books. We've even seen legal regulation everywhere from Uruguay to Canada, Germany, legalization of cultivation in places like Ghana, Morocco. All this change really driven by the efforts of so many of the people in this room. You know, people have volunteered in needle exchange programs and safe consumption rooms. People have compiled evidence and drafted reports. People have gone on news channels and debated with people who didn't want to hear the importance of a compassionate drug policy program. And people have really made these sacrifices in order to get to where we are at the moment. You know, so many people I know in this room have sacrificed their time, sacrificed their energy, their whole lives to this cause, have been stigmatized and shamed, have been demonized by their communities, lost friends, lost jobs because of their belief in changing our drug policy long before it was fashionable to say so. And I think what I want to do with my talk today is to really emphasize that I don't want this concentrated effort, all this blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice that went into pushing back against prohibition to merely have cleared the terrain for profiteering and wealth accumulation by actors who wouldn't be seen near a safe needle injection program or a safe consumption room. Because looking around at drug policy in 2025, I think we need to recognize that a lot of the same Western actors that were invested in some of the zero tolerance, just say no, militarized war on drugs that Ali and Silvie have demonstrated place such a destructive impact, not just in places like the US and the UK, but especially in places like Colombia, places like Mexico, places like Guinea-Bissau. A lot of these actors have already moved on from the war on drugs to the war for drugs, to controlling the actual, what Ali described as the matrix and network of power that controls the distribution, consumption, and production of substances all around the world. And we can see this especially in the kind of cohort that surrounds someone who's already been mentioned a few times in this conference, American President Donald Trump. A popular figure, as we can see. I think what we see is fascinating in terms of a glimpse of maybe the future of the war on drugs around the Trump administration, is that we see many of the tech entrepreneurs and Silicon Valley billionaires who have pumped up the Trump administration, investing in psychedelics, investing in legal cannabis, while simultaneously supporting a president who is declaring his ambition to introduce the death penalty to drug traffickers in the United States of America, and openly salivating over having the same type of mass incarceration system that we see with now Bukele in El Salvador. We saw recently their BFF news show at the White House. And I think this idea of having militarized mass incarceration alongside commercial monopolization provides a real challenge for those of us in this field thinking about how we want to move into the future. Already, we see huge Western companies buying up licenses, seizing land in the global south, and registering patents over indigenous knowledge, delegitimizing indigenous knowledge like Sylvia mentioned, in order to claim ownership over plant medicines that have been used by human beings for over 5,000 years. If we go back a little bit, before the war on drugs, before Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and Harry Anslinger and Bishop Brent, we go to the 19th century where a lot of the substances that we came to call drugs over the last 100 years, cocaine, opium, and cannabis, were being sold in European pharmacies with little restrictions. There was one type of drug that was actually quite stigmatized and quite shamed, and the doctors would get in trouble for prescribing, at least amongst their communities. And those were drugs with medical patents. Doctors at that time saw the medical patent as an unethical attempt to monopolize medicine. But that is no longer the case today. At the same time, as an architecture of prohibition was constructed in the 20th century, we also constructed an architecture for protecting drugs at the same time. An architecture that really reached its apotheosis with the culmination of the World Trade Organization's creation of the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or the TRIPS Agreement, as it's better known. TRIPS harmonized and strengthened intellectual property rights globally, guaranteeing exclusive rights to commercialize a drug for patent holders, usually for a period of 20 years or so, blocking others from making, using, or selling these drugs without paying that rent. Now, the reason for this given was the idea that this would protect investment for research. However, the monopolization of drugs by patent holders has been heavily criticized as a contributing factor to multiple public health crises, where medication for people, which was desperately needed, was withheld by patent holding companies in order to extract further rent. Now, this has been particularly devastating in the global south, in places like Africa and Latin America, and perhaps most visibly in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, where access to the COVID vaccine was monopolized Companies like Pfizer, who are the main drivers of the TRIPS agreement. This wasn't cooked up just by diplomats. The pharmaceutical industry drove this type of legislation. And yet, holding on to these crucial medicines in the name of profit has devastated lives all around the world. And now, what do we see? We see hundreds of medical patents being registered over not just medicines, but medical procedures that derive from cannabis and psychedelics all across Europe and America. This is happening before legal regulation is placed on the books. Because it's important to remember that just because a drug is illegal doesn't mean that companies cannot register patents claiming ownership of inventions related to it. All they need to do is argue that their invention is something novel from the naturally derived plant. However, and here's the kind of cruel irony of prohibition, because prohibition drove these drugs underground and demonized the history of these substances used by indigenous communities all across the planet, and what counts as knowledge, as Silvia taught us, what registers as knowledge in this colonial framework, it means the companies can now register new discoveries for plants and the use of plants that have been known by communities in traditional communities for generations. If you want to see an example of this, you can look at all these patents that are being registered at the WIPO Patent Scope or the European Patent Office. Some of them claim ownership over things like, and this is not an exaggeration, administering psilocybin orally, because no one had ever thought to administer psilocybin orally until that was registered. Or, another one, administering psilocybin in a room that comprises soft furnishing. Someone's thought that up themselves. Thank God they came up with this invention. What can be the long-term consequences of this monopolization of the emerging markets in cannabis and psychedelics? We can look at some of the other medicines, and we can look at how they have been hoarded over the past 100 years or so. Insulin, for example, costs around $10 to produce, but it's estimated that 1 in 5 Americans with diabetes can't afford treatment and have to ration their care because of price gouging and because of inflated monopolized prices. There's also an issue with lack of transparency. We might know by reading the WIPO or European Patent Office that a medical patent has been claimed over something like psilocybin, but we might not always know who the company are because they've registered themselves and registered that patent in one of these offshore jurisdictions that are so popular in the new emerging markets around cannabis and psychedelics, places like Delaware in the United States, or places like Jersey off the coast of the United Kingdom. With all of this, it made me think about what has changed from the war on drugs in the mid-high point of the 1980s to today, which allows many of the actors who were so vocal about a militarized opposition to drugs to now be taking out licenses and investing in cannabis and psychedelic companies. We can think of the economic stagnation that's hit the West over the last 100 years, where now capitalists are looking for new growth markets. We can look at the way in which the protectionism and competition between the US and China is leading to the West looking for new markets for innovation and for growth. We can look at that construction of an intellectual property system that has facilitated the growth of big pharma, as I just mentioned. We can talk about the emergence of international investment law and the fact that now multinational pharmaceutical companies are confident in being able to protect their rights against the interests of the state through investor-state dispute resolution tribunals or arbitration panels. An example of that, we can look at Philip Morris trying to sue the Australian government when it introduced tobacco controls. And we know Philip Morris, of course, moving into the cannabis. Because of data exposure, we look at all these in what creeped the very 1960s and the 1970s, when the West really pushed this war on drugs. And so what I want us to think about is, how can we ensure that, due to the stigmatization and due to the demonization of the war on drugs, through regulation, we are not allowing actors who haven't done the hard work that so many of the people in this room have done, who haven't been working with drug-using communities, who haven't been working with land rights communities, from simply profiting from the high barriers of entry that are being created in what they imagine is going to be a new, lucrative, and colonially structured market. I want to point to the transition out of American prohibition as an example for how this trajectory might go. Prior to the Volstead Act, passed in the United States of America, the alcohol industry was relatively diverse. There were breweries, distilleries, saloons all across America, mapped out in this kind of decentralized small-scale structure. However, the aftermath of Prohibition saw a centralization of the alcohol industry in the hands of only a few oligopolistic actors. The sociologists Harry Levine and Craig Rominin explained that just 4 or 5 years after repeal, roughly 4/5 of all distilled liquor in America was manufactured by just 4 companies. And this is explicitly said as the ambition for what's happening with cannabis. In early 2024, Boris Jordan, the executive chairman of Curaleaf, who Forbes said was the first billionaire to come out of cannabis, told Bloomberg that he expects a major consolidation of the cannabis industry in the next few years. He imagines that there'll be no more than 5 to 10 companies who will dominate the market in a short period of time. Who will be the people in these markets? Will it be some of the communities that Ali told us about, who have been punished and had their lives destroyed through the prohibition and war on drugs during the era of criminalization? Will there be space for some of the land rights movements that Silvie told us about in this new consolidated market? I think unless we anticipate the moves that are coming down the line and try and think about how we can combat them, those people are going to be squeezed out of the new market the same way that they were punished in the era of prohibition. But a bit of positive news after my downer this morning to think about how we might be able to respond to this. I think one of the exciting things of working in drug policy in 2025 is the idea that we can use the shift of what have come to be called drugs from contraband to commodity to think about new ways that we can actually consume, produce, and distribute goods and live in a sustainable balance with each other and with the planet. We can think about experimenting for new forms of association and production. We could think about implementing ideas to ensure social emergence. We can implement research and allow developments in these medicines to be accessible to people all across the world. We could think about implementing things like seed banks the Global South cultivators and farmers are able to draw upon for low costs. We could even think about something like a psychedelic pharmaceutical research funding agency that's collectively put together that provides this resource and information for people, creating an almost pharmaceutical commons that would set an example, not just for people who have stigmatized and demonized drugs over the years, but also for all these other industries, thinking about other crop products, thinking about other medicines, thinking about other industries that have been asymmetrical in their distribution for the best part of a generation. I think this idea is something that excites me, And it's an idea that I think we can use to set an example to show how drugs can actually lead the way to a different type of economy and a different type of world, one that isn't so saturated in these colonial To do that, we need to rethink about what we value more, profit or people. And I just want to end with perhaps an optimistic story that might give people an inventivity. And after he interviewed Lisa and roasted who the pattern is. Mark replied, well, the people, I would say. There is no pattern. He responded, could you pattern the sun? In 2012, Forbes calculated that the polio vaccine would have been worth around $7 billion had it been patented. But Salk refused to patent it because he decided that curing infant paralysis was more important than enriching his own bank account. And the ultimate irony is that because Salk gave away the vaccine, he actually lived his life almost like a billionaire. People would pay for his dinners when he went out for dinner. When he got on the airplane, pilots would announce who he was and what he did, and the whole plane would erupt in applause. He was able, despite being an American scientist at the very heart of colonial capitalism, to realize that there was more wealth in human beings and the generosity of human beings than there was in the ownership and monopolization of knowledge for your own personal profit. And I think that that could be an example for how we move into the new world on drugs. Thank you.
Yes, yes, and yes. Reminds me of, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, where people in the US would say that indigenous people, native people in America won in recovery because they participated in their own medicine, peyote, ayahuasca, and many other things. And then a few years later, those same people would say, Sam, can you get me to one of those ceremonies where your people use those things that make you feel really good and make you feel healthier? Very interesting in looking at the medicines we don't think about. I really appreciate that. Just very quickly remind you we're running late, because many of you were late. We're running late. So I just want to remind you of that. This is where you should be anyway. You shouldn't be going anywhere else. At least I don't think so. So, to bring us home, to wrap this up, she keeps telling me I'm putting pressure on her. But that's what happens when you're as, I'm on television. You're as amazing as Kokila Annamalai, co-founded the Transformative Justice Collective, and also co-founded Workers Make Possible. Brace yourself and enjoy her amazing words.
I'm a short person. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hi. Wow, this is really like a stage to alleviate all my imposter syndrome issues, isn't it? I will do my best to share. So I come from Singapore. And the Transformative Justice Collective, which my comrades and I organize with, is an abolitionist group. I also work with a labor and tenant rights group called Workers Make Possible, and Palestine Solidarity organizing in Singapore. So on the 19th of January this year, my brother Saeed Suhail received a notice informing him that the state planned to kill him in 4 days. This wasn't Saeed's first execution notice. In 2020, in the middle of a raging global pandemic, his murder was first scheduled. Perhaps an execution notice coming during the pandemic hit the people of Singapore differently, because this was a time when our communities were intimately confronting our mortality and rallying to save lives. Singaporeans had also experienced lockdown and movement restrictions due to the pandemic, so perhaps they felt a little more for the plight of this prisoner. I always say that Saeed started the Transformative Justice Collective, a grassroots movement which fights for the abolition of the death penalty, prisons, policing, surveillance, and all other forms of state violence and repression. I say that Saeed started it because it was a letter Saeed wrote to his lawyer after his execution notice in 2020 that moved us to dream more audaciously and to commit more deeply than we had before to the lives of our brothers and sisters behind bars. For roughly 2 years before Saeed's notice, there had been no executions in Singapore, though close to 60 people lived on death row, mostly for drug offenses. This had led us abolitionists to hope that perhaps there was an unofficial moratorium on the use of the death penalty. Saeed wrote in that letter, "I dream for better days because hope is my only possession." He also said in reference to the pandemic, "The powers that be have decided that to move forward and embrace the new normal is to resume judicial executions. The insensitivity and entirely new level of cruelty that decision makers have decided to unleash is felt more so by my loved ones, even though it is directed at me." Some of us shared his letter online, and the outcry from the public was unprecedented. The response took us aback because those of us who had been writing and campaigning for death penalty abolition before this had received mainly contempt, abuse, and stigma. I felt this moment was different. I organized a spontaneous Zoom event where Saeed's sister, the brother of another death row prisoner and a fellow anti-death penalty activist, spoke. The announcement for the event had only been up for a few hours, but more than 100 people joined us on Zoom that evening, 2 nights before Saeed was meant to be killed. Against all odds, after a valiant fight in the courts, Saeed managed to win an interim stay on the eve of his execution. Some of us who had been on that Zoom call went on to start the Transformative Justice Collective together, including Saeed's sister Mila. Over the next few weeks, I came to learn a lot more about Saeed. Saeed had first been incarcerated when he was 13 or 14 years old because he had started using drugs after he'd lost his mother to cancer at a very young age. Saeed spent most of his life in prison, in and out, in and out. Whenever he was out, defeated by the stigma, defeated by the lack of jobs, defeated by all the other forms of social punishment and cruelty that persisted, and then he'd land back in prison. Punished also by the lack of care, support services, harm reduction, and anything else that could have saved a young person who was dependent on drugs and suffering. This is a common story of prisoners on death row in Singapore. We've come to know many of them over the last few years, and their stories tend to follow 2 main trajectories. One, like Saeed, they've spent most of their lives in prison, first for use, and then for possession, and then because they become dependent on the drug trade and need to fund their drug use, some of them get entangled in selling, and then they get sentenced to death. Sometimes it's just because they have quite a bit of substances in their possession for their own use. But in Singapore, if the possession crosses a certain threshold, it's automatically trafficking and the death penalty. The other profile we see often on death row is young, rural Malaysians or people from other poorer countries around Singapore, from rural areas, who have been deceived, exploited, or who are in much desperation and therefore end up working in the drug trade. Sometimes they don't know that they're transporting drugs. Obviously, the businesses that exploit them target the most vulnerable, target those of them who are in debt, target those of them who live in abject poverty and who have little education or understanding of Singapore's laws. So one thing I've come to find as a staggering truth is that this is really a crime against children, because most of them either first were incarcerated when they were teenagers or in their very early 20s. The term drug trafficker obfuscates exploited workers, obfuscates the difference between exploited workers and drug business owners who accumulate capital. So one of the interventions we make at TJC is insisting on calling them drug trade workers if they are consenting, but if they're non-consenting, then they're not traffickers, they're trafficked. But either way, they should be treated as workers who are exploited and deserve protection, not death. Meanwhile, drug lords in Southeast Asia enjoy close ties with our business and political elite, and laws are constructed to shield these powerful drug business leaders. The first time I saw Saeed in the flesh was also the last time. I went to court for his stay hearing, and at that time, if the prisoner requested it, the judge would allow family members and friends in the gallery to speak to them for 2 minutes through a glass pane. Saeed waved enthusiastically when he saw me, and his voice was full of purpose. He always spoke in the collective, we, even when I asked him questions specifically about himself. In these short, precious moments I had with Saeed, he shared with me that all of them on death row were heartened that it finally felt like Singaporeans cared about them. He brought up how a large majority of death row prisoners are ethnic minorities and urged us to talk about how racism and poverty affect those who are condemned to death. He talked about how he still had a voice and asked why the prison didn't allow him to use it, didn't allow members of the public to ask him questions through his family, didn't allow journalists or activists to interview him. He reminded me that there were women on death row too, and he was worried they would be forgotten because they were housed in a different unit from the men, and they didn't know much about them or their families. All of us on death row are fighting for our lives, and I want my case to help the others, to give them hope. We deserve to be heard. Over 20 of us have applied for clemency and had it rejected. Please don't stop speaking up and fighting for us. We are grateful for everything you're doing, for paying attention. These were his last words to me that day. It was my first time at a court hearing in a capital case. It was surreal and soul-crushing to listen to the court discuss Saeed's execution in such a clinical, administrative manner while he sat there, so very alive. The issue at hand was whether Saeed could be executed before a Malaysian prisoner who was sentenced before him. It appeared that due to the border closures, the prison had decided to skip the Malaysians and execute the Singaporeans first, as the Malaysian families would not be able to come to Singapore for the final visit. These are the absurdities of technical legal systems. Another reason that a death row prisoner has received a stay before is because he contracted COVID, and it wouldn't be humane to execute someone while they have COVID. I kept wondering how it must sound to Saeed's ears to hear the court deliberate the technicalities of his execution, all the while never addressing him directly, never acknowledging him, never referring to him by name. What he must feel about the morbid fact that lawyers and judges had gathered to fix a fair time for the willful termination of his life, because fairness lay in whether he was killed before or after the Malaysian prisoner, not in whether he was killed at all. Saeed felt really strongly about being heard, so I wrote about my conversation with him online and urged the public to attend court hearings in capital cases, to come face to face with the humanity of the people our government is putting to death. After that, TJC started announcing court hearings for death row prisoners and rallied the public to attend with us. This shifted and shook many people being in court, witnessing what was happening. It is unlikely to be a coincidence that immediately restrictions on speaking to prisoners in court were tightened, and eventually the prison stopped bringing death row prisoners to court entirely. All their hearings in the last few years have been over Zoom. The first campaign TJC organized was a letter-writing campaign called Dear Saeed, which invited members of the public to write to him in prison. Dozens of letters were sent and also poured into our emails. Poems, drawings, people telling him about birdsong, leaf rain, and other experiences they wished he could share in. Children wrote joke books and sent him handmade cards. I remember multiple conversations with parents who told me how the campaign had given them the chance to pluck up the courage to talk to their kids about the death penalty. A friend's 9-year-old daughter broke down when she explained Saeed's story to her and said, "I'm just a kid, but you're an adult. Why aren't all of you adults stopping this?" All the letters, poems, riddles, and drawings we sent to Saeed were blocked by the prison, citing security reasons. He never got to see them. The state went on to intensify punitive action against lawyers who fought for death row prisoners. This, in addition to a blanket ban on legal aid for death row prisoners at later stages of their case. Over the last few years, despite unbelievable challenges, death row prisoners in Singapore have taken incredible and historic collective action by coming together to fight against the injustices of Singapore's Misuse of Drugs Act, when no other lawyer dared to. Encouraged by the movement we are building, many prisoners like Saeed have led the other prisoners in these legal challenges. Because no one other than immediate approved family members are allowed to visit the prisoners, we rely on their families to pass messages between us. Family members aren't even allowed to bring in paper and pen to visits, so they have to memorize all the legal arguments, technical questions, and speaking notes the prisoner and their family want to convey to each other. Many of the prisoners cannot read or write, especially in English, and neither can their families. They don't have access to law books, libraries, or internet searches. Despite this, it is a stunning sight to see them in court when they make bold, eloquent arguments, fighting hard against highly qualified and obscenely paid state prosecutors. But once the prisoners started filing these joint cases, the government moved to introduce a new law, the Post-Appeal and Capital Cases Act, which hugely limited their right to bring applications at later stages of their case. The threshold was already very high, and now it was further out of reach. The government claimed that death row prisoners were abusing the court's process through their applications, and this bill would protect the administration of justice. We are told to believe that desperate attempts to save human lives undermine the court's sanctity. In the world we live in, a court that cages and kills our fellow people has sanctity, and the impulse to fight for life is abusive. In the last year, the prison has also stopped allowing prisoners to pass legal documents to each other or help each other prepare for cases. They've introduced severe restrictions on what can be shared during family visits. Legal documents sent by family members have been obstructed, with the prison telling them that only lawyers are allowed to send such documents in. None of them have lawyers. To our horror, we also learned that the prison moved the prisoners who already lived in solitary cells for over a decade to new quarters where their cells were much further apart from each other, where they could not shout to each other across cell walls. These cells are smaller, the doors are solid, with no gaps through which they could see each other walk by for their solitary yard time. Family members tell us that the new conditions have led to many of the prisoners having suicidal thoughts, breaking down during visits, and the families fear that they won't be able to keep up the will to fight in these conditions. Newer prisoners facing death sentences are now housed in a separate unit, ensuring that they cannot be supported by or learn from the experiences of the prisoners who've been there longer. Access to the few things they had, like ice cubes and CD players, have been taken away. In the words of one of the prisoners, these cells seem designed to force us into accepting our fate and passively awaiting death. This is their punishment for daring to challenge the death penalty regime in Singapore. When we lost Masood last November, we knew the leaders among the prisoners would soon be killed, one by one. We fondly called Masood death row's legal scholar. His understanding of constitutional law and justice would put most human lawyers to shame. Masood was executed while he had ongoing legal proceedings. including a constitutional challenge in which he was representing 36 prisoners, which was set to be heard in January this year. The big becomes the swifter and harsher the clampdown has been. Last October, an exhibition we had planned on the death penalty regime in Singapore, featuring letters from death row prisoners, was banned from going ahead. That same month, I defied a correction order issued to me by the government under its fake news law for my reportage on a death row prisoner's execution. To our knowledge, this was the first time that someone living in Singapore had refused to comply with a government-mandated correction order under this draconian law. So it's untested territory. Under the law, I could face up to a year in prison and thousands of dollars in fines for not complying. But what happened next is what was really cool. 33 other people put up my post in solidarity, the one that the government had deemed fake news. I believe the government was afraid of further defiance if they issued all 33 people correction orders, so they took the easy way out and issued a targeted correction order to Meta, requiring them to add a warning to our post saying that it contained false statements and providing a link to the correct facts on the government website. Meta obviously complied. The government's attacks on TJC via police investigations, criminal charges, and the fake news law have intensified over the last year. And this January, 2 days after Saeed received the execution notice, for the second time, we were forced to cease all operations of our website and social media accounts because the government had designated them declared online locations. It hit me hard that the first post we had ever published on TJC's pages was Saeed's story. How this journey of studying and exposing the horrors of Singapore's carceral systems had started with Saeed's first execution notice, and now, over 4 years later, as his life was about to be taken, the platforms he had moved us to create had come to a standstill. In February, one of our members was charged for holding candlelight vigils outside the prison on the eve of various executions. These vigils are usually attended by between 5 to 10 people who would place flowers around a photo of the prisoner, light candles, sit in silence together, and sometimes sing, "We Shall Overcome." They would routinely be harassed by police officers and forced to move on. Even quiet grief is too threatening for the authoritarian state, which demands complete control over every aspect of our private and public lives. So we insisted on grieving at a park in the center of the city, where we laid out shrouds for all 13 prisoners who had been executed that year, offering flowers and gathering over 300 people. In 1975, when Singapore's then Minister for Home Affairs made his case in Parliament as to why Singapore should introduce the death penalty for drug offenses, he said of Singapore's young people, "Once ensnared by drug dependence, they will no longer be productive digits, contributing to our economy and social progress." That was the first and last time that our government gave away some of their true intention behind the war on drugs. My government and other proponents of the war on drugs are not wrong. They didn't make a mistake. They carefully, calculatedly unleashed the brutality of the drug war as a means to discipline workers, to keep citizens compliant, to create a suitable enemy bigger and more threatening than the authoritarian capitalist state, so as to persuade us to succumb to them and believe that it is for our own security. They do it to manufacture dangers that distract us from the real and pressing dangers of our lives under racial capitalism, and to legitimize the authoritarian power. They do it to maintain and entrench the global racial order. They keep us preoccupied with fearsome myths about how much worse things could be, so that we never ask for better than what we have. Our government knows that a state which has its citizens' permission to kill them has absolute power. Till very recently, suicide was criminalized by the same state. And my favorite party trick at drug policy conferences is to tell you all how I cannot do drugs while I'm here because it's an offense for Singaporeans to do drugs overseas too. Our government makes it very clear who our bodies belong to. The war on drugs, like every other form of capitalist and state brutality, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They construct the future through the present management of subjects labeled as threats and risks. Prohibition makes the prophecy come true by forcing people into desperation. The war on drugs is just one of many useful theaters to racial capitalism and authoritarian control. So as we speak of defeating or ending the war on drugs, we must be vigilant to what other forms of disposability, exploitation, expropriation, crises, and violence persist or become newly manufactured. Because these systems of oppression and imperialism thrive on crisis. They're both the cause and consequence of crises. Every crisis is an opportunity to entrench their oppressive power and violence further. When we are awake to this, I believe we can become stronger at building a unified movement for liberation from all forms of oppression. Our movements in Singapore, whether for abolition, for labor, for Palestine, or otherwise, have become bolder, not because the political climate in Singapore has become friendlier, rather the contrary. We've become bolder because we have built militancy, a culture of radical care and solidarity, as well as skill in how we anticipate, navigate, and respond to punishments from the state, employers, schools, our families, and more. Because in an authoritarian state, it is not just the state that punishes you, and it acts through every single vehicle and social system. Do I have time? Am I out of time? Okay. Okay, I have maybe 2 more minutes. Okay. So I want to move to close by telling you another little anecdote about what happened in March this year. So our Law and Home Affairs Minister, K. Shanmugam, is the most aggressive proponent of the death penalty and the war on drugs in Singapore. And he's the architect of most of our repressive laws. So in March, 2 sisters went to meet him at what our MPs, members of parliament, called the Meet the People session, which are supposed to be sessions where people go and beg and plead with the MP to help them with their parking fines or help them with getting their kids into a school that they want and things like that, right? But the 2 sisters went there to challenge him about issuing these fake news orders to TJC and to talk to him about the death penalty. And they're not part of TJC, so they're just part of our broader movement that's been growing. And he had all his thugs video record them and intimidate them and surround them. And so they held up a middle finger to the video cameras. And this was front page news the next day. Of course, it's the icing on the cake that the 2 sisters are also hijabis, and it was Ramadan, period. So, everybody went crazy, like, oh my God, how can hijabis during Ramadan hold up the middle finger, right? To top it off, they called him a coward. They shouted, coward, coward, at him repeatedly when he refused to talk to them. So I love this story, right? Because while initially there was so much moral outrage against the sisters, soon the conversation shifted. It became more nuanced and deeper about why we were so focused on the propriety of people challenging oppression when this man literally presides over murders week after week, month after month. And that is because it's civilized state murder versus uncivilized challenging of the civilized state murder, according to the norms we've been taught to accept. In our movements, we've learned to be shapeshifters, to quickly cobble together recovery plans, change tactics, adapt, laugh, cry, rage, cuddle, and reground in our principles and in our audacious dreams for life. We've learned to keep showing up for each other, just like many of you continue to do for decades. And we've learned to collectivize our resistance into larger and larger numbers of undaunted comrades. History teaches us that when acts of oppression are answered with defiance and organized resistance, authoritarian power has no choice but to wither. I don't want to romanticize this process, though, or gloss over the suffering that prisoners, families, and people in our movements endure, the heavy price we pay for our resistance. But I have a firm belief that my freedom and my life are only worth what I will lay them down for. There is no punishment heavier than the loss of our humanity, spirit, or imagination. And any other loss, however horrific, can be borne to keep these things alive. And in the struggle between life and death, those who fight for life will triumph one day. Because even as our hearts break again and again, our spirits live. Solidarity forever.
I tried to warn you. Okay. So before I say a couple of closing remarks, I first want to ask you to join me in acknowledging the great speakers again, please. So just a couple of quick things I wanted to add. I first want to take this opportunity on an international stage to acknowledge and thank all of our staff at On Point NYC, current and past. Also, yesterday I had the opportunity to visit 2 local programs out here, which were just full of love and full of passion and care for their participants, and it just reminds me about just how much all of our work, really transcends across the countries and across the world. And it really touched me yesterday, and I thank those folks who gave us access and allowed us to come visit. And lastly, when people ask what is harm reduction, I want to share a couple of answers. Harm reduction is community. Harm reduction is safety. Harm reduction is keeping beautiful people alive. Harm reduction is healthcare. Harm reduction is wellness. It's also a place where many people are loved and begin their journeys. Harm reduction is love. And as we all know, love wins. Thank you very much.